Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for NASW's Juneteenth Town Hall. I hope you're having a great day. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this town hall because over a year ago, when NASW decided to launch this series of interactive town halls on racial equity from a social work perspective, we set out on a journey to engage in thoughtful, provocative, and many times uncomfortable conversations about advancing racial equity. Today, we are taking another deliberate and purposeful step in our steadfast journey. Social work is unique in its dual focus of enhancing well-being and championing social justice. Yet, our profession's history is linked to many shameful chapters in America's untold stories. Despite visible leadership in our nation's most important social justice movements and in creating our country's safety net, the social work profession has sadly contributed to ongoing discrimination and oppression of people of color through its systems, its policies, and practices. The National Association of Social Work just released its first report to the profession on racial justice priorities and action. The report's first section acknowledges that our profession has not always lived up to its mission of pursuing social justice for all and apologizes for our role in policies and actions that harm people of color. The second section of the report outlines NASW's efforts on racial justice advocacy over the past year and our priorities for the next coming year. The report is available for viewing and downloading at www.socialworkers.org/racial justice. I'll say that again, www.socialworkers.org/racial justice. It's available to download at this event. Please do so and share that widely. It is it will be a historical document documenting the times that we have just lived through. On our last note, before we begin this great panel, for those of you who are in the audience that are NASW members, I thank you. It is because of your support that we can offer these events free of charge. If you're not a member of NASW, I humbly request that you join. Your dues not only enable us to many benefits, but you're needed now more than ever as a member in advancing NASW's broad social justice portfolio, which, as you will hear today, centers on racial equity. So thank our members, continue to stay with us. New members, join us so that we can bend that arc of justice towards equity, towards all. Now, it's my great privilege to introduce the moderator for today, Dr. Gary Bailey. Dr. Gary Bailey is the past president of NASW's National Board, and he's the ASI president for NASW Assurance. He currently serves as the Assistant Dean for Community Engagement and Social Justice in the College of Social Sciences, Policy and Practice at Simmons University. He is also a professor of practice at Simmons University School of Social Work and has a secondary appointment at the Simmons University School of Nursing and Health Sciences. At Boston University School of Public Health, Maternal and Child Health Center for Excellence, Dr. Bailey also serves as a mentor in the Diversity Scholars Lectures Program, which supports emerging health professionals from underrepresented minority communities who seek to be leaders in the movement to eliminate health and other inequities and the achievement of social justice. Gary, in fact, all of the colleagues that you'll see today are not only my colleagues, they're my advisors, and most importantly, they are my friend. Gary, I look forward to hearing you moderate and ask provocative questions. And of course, you know, this Juneteenth holiday that was passed the other day, and as soon as President Biden signs it into law, we've got to talk about that because it's about Emancipation Proclamation. It's about freedom. It's about voting. Don't let us give them you. Don't let people give you a day yet nullify your vote. So, Gary, you know I was going to say something challenging to you. Thank you so much for doing this. Take
Thank
it.
you, man.
Bye bye.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And greetings, everyone, and welcome to this very significant and important event. I'm going to introduce our panel, and I'm going to start with Janley Wong. Janley Wong is the former executive director of the California chapter of NASW. During Mr. Wong's tenure, he worked on enormous social justice and anti-racism efforts, including DEI efforts in NASW and membership, increasing professional development, education, focusing on practice and policies in communities of color, and racial equity policy advocacy. Mr. Wong served on the boards of the Council of Social Work Education, the NASW Presidential Initiative on Diversity, the California Social Work Education Center, and the California Board of Behavioral Sciences and several schools of social work advisory boards. I had the pleasure of working with Janley Wong over my tenure as president of NASW, and we could not be in better hands than to have his thoughts and opinions on this panel. Janley, welcome to the panel. Next, I'd like to introduce, one second there. Next, I'd like to introduce Yolanda C. Padilla. Dr. Padilla is the Clara Pope Willoughby Centennial Professor in Child Welfare at the University of Texas at Austin Steve Hicks School of Social Work. That's a mouthful. And is director of the Council on Social Work Education Center for Diversity and Social and Economic Justice. She conducts research on social disparities and teaches courses in social justice, interculturality, social welfare and practice in communities and organizations. Dr. Padilla's approach to teaching social justice involves building a learning environment in which students become co-creators in their own learning and can construct new narratives and see themselves as builders of a more just society. Welcome, Dr. Padilla. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karina, one second there we go. Dr. Karina Walters. Dr. Walters is an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, is the Catherine Hall Chambers Scholar and the co-director and principal investigator of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. Dr. Walters has over 25 years of experience in social epidemiological research on the historical, social, and cultural determinants of health among American Indians and Alaska Natives, as well as chronic disease prevention research. Much of this social epidemiological work has targeted urban and LGBT, Two-Spirit, AIAN populations. She also conducts tribally based intervention research in the areas of substance abuse, obesity, diabetes, and HIV/AIDS prevention, particularly among American Indian women. Methodologically, she has expertise in decolonizing methodologies, particularly with respect to designing community-based, culturally grounded interventions. Prior to her career in academia, Dr. Walters was a community-based psychotherapist and served as the commissioner for the Los Angeles County Indian Commission. Welcome, Dr. Walters, and welcome to all of our panelists today. And so I'd like to begin with a question, and the way in which this will work, let me explain the way in which I've envisioned this discussion, is I'm going to ask each individual panelist a question for which they will take the lead, and then invite the other participants to, and they'll speak for about 5 minutes at the maximum on the question that's asked, and then invite the other panelists to also share their opinion should they have one on that topic. And then I have questions for each of the panelists, and then we'll open for Q&A. Those are being monitored in the chat, and then will be identified by Raffaele Vitelli, a member of the NASW staff, who will be letting us know what the questions are and reading them to the community for panelists to respond to. So that's our process as we move forward today. And so the first question that I want to direct is to Janly Wong. And Janly, I'd like you to talk about, 1 second, there we go. Has the social work profession evolved in its understanding? I'm sorry, actually, I've got my order confused. Karina, this question is directed to you. Has the social work profession evolved in its understanding of race and discrimination? And if so, how? Has the social work profession evolved in its understanding of race and discrimination? And if so, how? Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Thank you so much, Gary Mitt, and I want to acknowledge Juneteenth and the day of Jubilee and celebration that's coming up, and celebrating emancipation. And I'm with Mitt about voting, so that's a conversation for a little bit later. But let me first say, halitosa hachifa tatu puche kanchan spoacha biche yahoyo miche chata si hoke miche yakoke okla dawamash. Greetings, everybody. My name is Karina Walters. I'm enrolled in the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I greeted you from the ancestral lands of the Snohomish and acknowledged all the ancestral lands in which you sit today. And I am really excited about this report that came out. It's groundbreaking. It's the first important step. And the way I'm going to answer this question, Gary, is how has social work evolved? I'm going to answer it with a story from our traditions in the indigenous way. We have an ancient story about the sacred fire, and the sacred fire on earth represents God on earth. Literally, the sun's representation on earth is manifest through the fire. And so for our traditions, historically, we held sacred fires annually and very elaborate ceremonies. And that ceremony involved putting out the sacred fire and reconciling our transgressions, reconciling our trespasses on others, and to move forward in that acknowledgement to create a new fire, a new covenant with each other, and start a new chapter. And when I read this report, that was what I felt was happening, that covenant has been set, and we've established a new fire. And the story that goes with this lighting the fire process, the ceremony, long time ago, the ancient high priests would sit at the top of the tall mounds, and they would guard that sacred fire. There were always two priests that would guard that sacred fire because it was so sacred. That covenant is that sacred. One day, one of the priests got really sleepy, and he said, "Go ahead, take a," the other priest said, "Go ahead and take a rest. I will guard the sacred fire. Don't worry." Well, he got sleepy too, and in the middle of the night, the fire went out. He was panicked. He felt horrible that he had not kept awake and alert to take care of that fire. What he did was he relit the fire. He went over to do that. He went over and he woke up his brother and he said, "Brother, can I have this a new flame for my pipe?" And he said, "Sure, here, go smoke your pipe for the people. It'll be beautiful." And he snuck over and he relit that fire, and that fire became soiled and it became defiled in that moment because he wasn't honest in that fire. And so that fire was relit and everyone thought everything was fine. And then everyone was overcome with a big sickness. People started dying in the community because that fire was not properly maintained. And even that person, it's a longer story, but that person who relit that fire in the wrong way, he started dying, and he called all of the rest of the Ishtaholo, the sacred priest, together and said, "I need to make this correct. I need to make this right. It's my fault this happened." He said, I relit the fire without telling anyone, and I tried to say everything was okay, and it wasn't." And so what they did is they had to go running to the neighboring villages and take fire from the sacred fire that had been lit there to rekindle. They had to go to other villages to rekindle that fire and start it again before this priest died. And that's our story to remind us that when we light these fires, there is this incredible sacred covenant. It's something that we take very seriously. We cannot let it. We have to be watchful. We have to be mindful now of nurturing that covenant in a new way. And we cannot pretend that it's healthful if it becomes unhealthful in any kind of way, because it brings sickness to everybody. And it literally takes other villages, everybody working together to keep that fire sacred. So that's the story I'm sharing today. That's what I got through from this report. And I think that this is what's happening, is that sacred fire has been lit with us starting to talk about racism. And I'm talking about moving beyond undoing racism, because undoing racism implies doing racism is a verb, when in fact it's not a verb. It's based in structures, and settler colonialism and structural racism, that is the Manhattan of, I would say, is the handmaiden of settler colonialism, but I'll address that later. And I think we're moving in that direction in a helpful way to address structural racism through the actions and acknowledging our transgressions. And we still have more work to do in that area, I think, but not to live in that place, but to really move forward so that our fire can benefit the people. And so my 5 minutes is up, but that's what I wanted to share in response.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And we'll hold on to that image of the sacred fire and also the honesty that goes in maintaining that sacred fire. Jen Lee, any thoughts or reflections from your perspective on this first question about the social work profession?
Well, you know, when something starts at the beginning, it's usually not perfect. And I think over the years, when we learned about social work, we came up with this idea that, oh, social work is really a great profession and there are no flaws or anything like that. And I'm obviously disabused of that notion for many years now. And so the question is, have we learned from the past, which, believe me, this event is one of the first attempts to learn from the past, and which way are we going in terms of going forward? So I would say probably we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Black Lives Matter movement. And it precedes George Floyd, as everybody knows, and it goes back many, many years. Michael Ferguson, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, etc. Trayvon Martin, many, many, many names. It's just too numerous to name. But over that time, social work has had to come to grips with not only what it's trying to do today, but also to do some soul searching of its own and say, you know, were we complicit? Did we really get involved with that? I know in my own career, very early on working for the County of San Diego, I saw some statistics on the child welfare system, and it was appalling. the disproportionality of Black and brown children in the child welfare system, a system that literally tears families apart. You know, we do have to protect children. You know, there is serious child abuse, but it was done in such a way that it was not culturally reflective and sensitive, and there always seemed to be lots of racism, both systematic and institutional racism throughout the system and among social workers, child welfare workers. So I think over time, by highlighting that and asking questions, I kept asking that question up until I retired, and I'll still ask that question afterwards. And I'll push, I'll say, we're all social workers in the room. You know, why can't we make some changes to improve this situation? So in terms of evolving, that's what social work is doing. And let's not try to think we can make the world perfect tomorrow. You know, that was one of our big failings early on in the profession of social work. Let's just keep saying that it's incremental. We need to make those changes. We will. It's a huge, complex system, very hard to move, but we will do it. We will keep trying and not give up.
Thank you, Jen Lee. Yolanda, has the social work profession evolved in its understanding of race and discrimination? If so, how? Your thought on that initial, our first question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the three of us have similar thoughts. I was thinking about what Katrina said. This is what I've been thinking also, and that is the idea of nurturing the things that we believe in and the things that we need to work for, and also nurturing them, but also kind of reinventing them every time. Every generation has to reinvent it. It doesn't just come through. I'm thinking about in terms of whether the profession has, you know, evolved or whatever. I'm thinking about my own studies in social work and how when I was a student, I remember that in a lot of the courses in general, not just social work, I never saw myself. I never saw discussions of Latino families. And in fact, I remember thinking, because I also studied psychology, that psychology wasn't supposed to have to do anything with actual people. It was, you know, so, and then in social work, you know, thinking about the way Latinos were perceived. And again, you know, social work is so interdisciplinary. We study a lot of different things. Was quite negative. And so those were the kinds of things that we were being taught as future social workers about different groups. And I have seen that evolved in an exciting way where the research and the kinds of things that we talk about and that we teach about different groups in this country are much more in tune with the reality of different communities, which often, you know, from the outside, our communities are painted often negatively, but we have so many well-kept secrets of strength and all those kinds of things. So I don't think that something like actually just evolves and it gets to a certain point. As I think we all agree, we're constantly evolving it, and we are part of a system. We're part of a bigger world. So the issues of the kinds of things that we have been involved in that were not positive, it was a whole society doing these kinds of things. And I always wished that we as social workers would be at least, you know, one step ahead. It's not surprising to find that we did some of those things. It's a terrible thing, but like I said, I wish we would be ahead of the rest of the country in terms of saying, wait, we shouldn't be doing that.
Mm. So I think it's interesting as I listen to the three of you, what's going through my head is really thinking about, and it was Jan Lee who made me initially think about, our profession. If we go back and really think about the forming of NASW as an entity, it was soon thereafter, or right along the same time as the murder of Emmett Till. So that if we think about our organization, the life of our organization, the markers have been, in many ways, hallmarks of America's unfettered racism and white supremacy, acting out in the ways in which it has impacted Black lives, Asian lives, Latino and Latinx lives, Hispanic lives, queer lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what does it mean to start out on the wrong side of an issue? And can you grow and move to where you end up on the right side of it? And then can you anticipate and lead it so that you get to the side that no one even knows where it needs to be? So I think that that's a very exciting way of thinking about that evolution. And then Katrina, I was struck by your image of fire, and I was reminded of the words of Boston abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who was accused of always speaking so broadly and loudly and passionately. And so once he was asked, why did he speak with such fire in his voice as he was being threatened by a lynch mob at Faneuil Hall? And he said, because there are hearts of ice before me that I have to melt. And so we use the fire to melt the hearts of ice that are before us. So another reason for us to keep that fire lit and going. Jen-Lee, would you talk about, take a few minutes to talk about key activities that NASW has undertaken over the past year that you're aware of or have participated in that around racial equity?
Yes, I want to thank NASW for organizing this event, especially Gail Waller and her staff, Dr. Angela McLean, and President Mitch Joyner. I think it's a fabulous event, and the document that was produced, everybody needs to read it and distribute it, as Mitch said. It's fitting and long overdue that this event coincides with Juneteenth becoming a national holiday. Growing up in California, Juneteenth was not mentioned in my textbooks or by my teachers, nor did I learn about it in college. It was only after I joined NASW and started attending Juneteenth celebrations did it become clear to me that no one is truly free until all of us are free. I also want to thank my wife and fellow social worker, Mariko Yamada, for introducing me to African American communities celebrating Juneteenth. She grew up in an African American community in Denver, her family having moved there after being incarcerated in a World War II Manzanar camp in the California desert. NASW's approach towards racial equality this past year was to hear authentic voices and stories about the trauma of racism and anti-Blackness, to see how people cope with societal and systematic racism, and in particular, how social workers have moved forward past their professions and the institution's history of racism, and how social workers are activists in seeking social justice. NASW's efforts can be framed into three categories: leadership and leadership development, education, and advocacy. In terms of leadership, NASW volunteers at the national and chapter level, its staff, and its NASW National Committee on Racial and Ethnic Diversity, as well as many chapter diversity committees, are all engaged in issuing public statements, conducting town halls, and essential chats on racism and racial justice. The town halls were a way to hear the authentic voices and inform NASW's actions. The public statements were a powerful single voice of professional social work that many social workers were asking for and defines NASW policy for years to come. This past year's actions included 11 public statements and 4 town halls. Specifically, 4 of the statements and 2 of the town halls acknowledged social work's history of racism and called for the end of hate, racism, and violence. The key statements included those condemning the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and demanding justice, dismantling racist policing, demanding that the past administration take stronger action, and praising the current administration for its efforts to address systemic racism. The key town halls included policing reform, economic and racial equity, and the social work leadership roundtables and essential chats on racial equity and the impact of racism on social work leaders. In these multiple efforts, NASW at the national chapter level called for and set up powerful collaborations of sister social work organizations, allied organizations, to build alliances and coalitions to fight racism and seek justice. NASW collaborated with the National Association of Black Social Workers, the Council on Social Work Education, the Association of Social Work Boards, the National Network for Social Work Management, and many others to tackle racism within profession and society. Education, both public and professional. National brought together the country's experts on this subject and brought them to every social worker and every member in this country through its online programming. National's and NASW town halls and essential chats were the ways for social workers of color to speak out and to receive support regarding their traumatic experiences with racism, and served as educational efforts for fellow social workers on its professional development platforms. Chapters are the backbone of the direct grassroots level education, providing webinars, online courses, and speakers on many current issues, meeting the local needs of social workers and their licensure CE mandates. 27 or more NASW chapters created educational policy and clinical content on their online platforms that recognized and acknowledged the pervasiveness of systematic racism and described ways on how to fight it, as well as how to treat the trauma. Examples from the California chapter include a course on Black youth suicide and mental health, and a course on clinical conversations about race and racism with Black students, and recently a course on stopping Asian American Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian hate. Media interviews included an NPR story on social work and police reform, and supported broad public education on how social work can help with police reform. Advocacy at the federal and state and local levels. National had quite a few congressional briefings, as well as chapters having state legislative briefings. These briefings included ideas about how to reform policing, as well as reimagining public safety, interrupting the school to prison pipeline, how fighting racism includes social work's whole systems approach involving socio and economic equity in wages, jobs, education, housing, and the environment. White House engagement. NASW met with White House staff on access to mental health and substance use services and how to improve provider rates. NASW urged the appointment of persons of color candidates who share social work values. National and chapters conducted advocacy or lobby days. A few examples: National's lobby day included police reform and public safety reimagining, as well as advocacy for the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. The California chapter included racial justice legislation that clarified peremptory jury challenges, barring the death penalty for persons with individual and intellectual disabilities, and extending opportunities for defendants to challenge racial bias in their cases. NASW clearly stepped up in 2020 and 2021 to acknowledge the past racism of social work and social workers, and to call for action to fight current racism and demand racial equity. But there's a lot more to do, and the next speaker will talk about that. But I just wanted to conclude by saying that while legal slavery ended across all the country on June 19th, 1865, and Jim Crow slowly faded in the last century, new forms of slavery and Jim Crow continue in this century. Sub-living wage jobs abound, leaving many, especially Black and brown people, on the verge of homelessness and despair. The mass incarceration of Black and brown people is but a slightly newer version of the chain gang. Integration and education won't fully achieve its lofty goals of equal quality education until we have economic equity. We won't know the beauty of living with each other until redlining and discrimination ends in housing. We can achieve these things if we learn to listen to each other. NASW's town hall meetings were a step forward in listening to each other. We can do more to end racism in this century if we work together.
Thank you, Jan Lee. And that's a comprehensive list. I'm wondering, Karina and Yolanda, let's start with Karina. If anything on that list is something that jumps out at you that you want to illuminate or talk a little bit about, or have a question about, a reaction to.
Well, two things in particular. First of all, Jan Lee, thank you. That was super comprehensive. So I am not going to repeat anything that you just said because you said it. It was phenomenal. I do think two things I want to highlight from what you expressed is the issue of visibility. That social work has stepped up and increased its visibility, not just to its constituents, but to allied partners and community to lead. We are leading. And historically, sometimes we've been a profession where we're so busy struggling with picking up the pieces that we don't see the frames in which we are operating, which continue to persist and reinforce structural racism. Even at times, as it's noted in the report, we've participated actively in supporting racist policies and practices, either with intent or with our complicity. And I think we're in a different place now, where now we are leading and not following. We are not picking up pieces. Rather, we are dismantling the structures, or looking to dismantle the structures that maintain these ways of racist and settler colonial policies. So I think that that is different. It's not about making nice, and it's not about, it's about truth telling, and it's about going beyond truth telling to actual action. So decolonization isn't a metaphor. It is actually something that we are talking about as a guiding practice. And I think that that is been entered into conversation, but I think we have a lot more work to do around what does that really look like? What are the tangible outcomes that we want to achieve in that? And that, to me, that makes me think about, there's a metaphor that was shared a long time ago by a Native Hawaiian elder that helped me shift my thinking, because I did a lot of work on historical trauma and the impact on health equity, right? And we know that the structural racism and economic inequalities and all of these things interact to produce and drive our health inequities. And I always think, if I was crabs in a bucket, this Hawaiian elder told the story about crabs in a bucket, and that saying, if fishermen put crabs in a bucket because when they try to crawl out, other crabs grab them back down and they pull them back in. And I always thought, if I was a social worker crab in the bucket, what would I do? If I was a clinical social worker, I'd be like, let's work on our internalized, crabism here. What are we doing that's pulling us down? What do we need to work on? If I was a community organizing crab, I'd be like, come on, let's rally together. Let's lift each other up. We can get out of this bucket. But you know what this elder said? That was the aha moment. And I think that's where social work is right now, this aha moment, which is, wait a minute. Do crabs live in a bucket? No, crabs don't live in a bucket. And why are we accepting bucket crab behavior as crab behavior? As this is a natural way of being in this world. Like somehow we have to endure racism. Somehow we have to endure the limits of the profession, how it's been to this point. And all of a sudden he said, no, crabs don't live in a bucket. Crabs live in the water and in the ocean. And what is actual crab behavior when you have a healthy environment? Actual crab behavior is to lift other crabs up onto rocks. They lift each other up. And I'm sure there's a couple of bad crabs that knock each other off, but the natural crab behavior is to lift each other up. And that made me think this is what our opportunity is, and this is where we're going, which is we've busted out of our buckets. We're starting to bust out the buckets and starting to think about how do we create healthy structures, healthy environments to produce healthy living, because natural healthy behaviors will follow. when we have healthy environments. Too often, we have worked what I call in a Bobo doll resilience framework. We help people prop them back up, only get knocked back down again without saying, why do we even have a Bobo doll? Back to your original comment, Gary, at the beginning of the session. Why did we need emancipation? So we need to look at the structures that are maintaining these standards and robusting. And so that's the bucket we got to dismantle, not these little tiny frames of where our profession has operated, or where we've worked so hard to just put pieces back together and help a family become whole again. It's the bigger picture. And I think that we're starting to do that with the actions we're taking right now. Thank
Yolanda,
you.
anything that you would add? Thank you, Karina. Can't hear you, Yolanda.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So the issue of truth telling, that is something that struck me in this report. Because we need to, I think we have a sense of these things happening, or in some cases we really know it, but to actually, have those things written down, but also it helps us operate in a real, with a sense of the reality, what's really happening as social workers. And when I saw that report, especially, well, both the whole report, but I thought about how powerful it would be in the classroom. And so we can't talk, for example, about the child welfare system, child protective services, that kind of thing, as only in terms of like the things that it does, the things that it's supposed to do, the policies, whatever. We have to talk about that in the way it really works. So child protective services, for example, when it comes to children in poverty or children of incarcerated parents, it is much more harsh, much more harsh. So we need to prepare our students and our social workers to have that reality and from the very beginning. So the other thing I wanted to say too is I'm always the macro person, but as I was reading the report, I was also thinking about something that we have to acknowledge, and that's many social workers out there who are helping people navigate impossible situations and who make a really big difference in individuals' lives, sometimes a difference that is going to affect the entire life of that person. So, working with families of incarcerated people, working with children in schools who may have something going on in their lives that it's really, really hard, and kind of navigating and helping them deal with a school that is saying, your grades are dropping and that, that's all they can see, or homeless people, all the people that we work with. That doesn't mean, of course, and nobody's suggesting this, that we're accepting the actual system and structure. But I'm always amazed, and even looking back when I was a social worker, at the resourcefulness of social workers to make things work for the people with whom we work, and the resourcefulness that they have had in sometimes working with us. But yes, so all in all, it's what I appreciate the most is the truth telling, and how a lot of times we read or we know about things that are going on, and we especially if it affects directly our community, we're thinking they're not getting it. That's not really what's happening here. And I'm talking about the broader community, not
Right.
not
So Yolanda, that's a great segue into a discussion as you look at the macro from the macro perspective. If we think about and this is directed at you, what types of racial equity achievements do you hope to see in the social work profession in the next few years, including actions to better prepare social work students? So as we think about the next iteration of the profession, that those next generations, how do we need to prepare them for the work that they're going to be doing, and then how do we infuse equity into that motif of, or that panoply of options and opportunities to do the work? Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So first, I want to say, that I'm very thankful for him to be invited to be part of this panel. And as we've been saying, I'm very pleased to see that the NASW acknowledgement of how our profession is implicated in systems of oppression, and because that opens the door to change. And it's something that we constantly have to be doing in checking ourselves, through the decades. Of course, also impressive are NASW's achievements in making ending all forms of oppression central themes in every aspect of the work, in education, advocacy, research, practice. So in terms of what I hope to see is just the continuation of this work toward fairness and justice in every realm of our work as a profession, and in all aspects of social welfare more broadly, because we're connected to all these other systems of education, criminal justice, health, all those things. So hearing President Biden yesterday after the summit in Geneva helped me put the work toward racial equity in perspective as it relates to actions to better prepare social work students. And as well as it relates to our constantly critically looking at these things and thinking about them. So referring to the current outward assault on voting rights and the Capitol insurrection of January 6th, Biden reminded us that every generation has to reestablish the basis in this fight for democracy. And they were playing that on every, Twitter, all that stuff. And I really, really liked that line, and I made sure that those were the exact words, so that every generation has to reestablish the basis in this fight for democracy. And what this means for social work educators is that we need to engage students in reestablishing their own guiding principles and beliefs for their generation. There is a quote that is a favorite of mine that is kind of my mantra in teaching justice. And this quote is a paraphrase of a line from a 1944 novel, and that captures this idea really well. And it says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. So if we as educators are able to help students discover a longing for justice, it's going to be that longing that's going to fuel their efforts in building a just society. So the skills to do the tasks, to organize the work, to strategize, obviously are not enough. So with this in mind, I would like to suggest 3 actions to better prepare social work students to embark on a path toward justice. First is finding ways to help students discover for themselves what injustice means in people's lives. There are things that others cannot imagine for us. They will have to imagine it for themselves. So we have to set up the learning environment so they do. So as Paulo Freire argued in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, students are not banks where we can deposit knowledge. People and students. Rather, they will only learn to long for justice if we fully engage them as full co-creators in their own education. We don't bring the truth to them. We're a community of learners. So as such, they will be able to envision more than a society without injustice. A society without injustice is really not, they will be able to envision the architecture of a just society. So I think of, for example, the Great Society. And I'm not saying that was a perfect society, but it involves so many things. It wasn't just the lack of injustice, but what are we going to have in education, in health, in arts, and stuff like that. Okay, the second route to prepare students is by changing the narrative in social work education around achieving justice. And we've been having that conversation in a way that was brought up by the whole Juneteenth situation. So we need to engage students in much more nuanced critical analyses of injustice. we need to use more concepts on racism, about racism, that translate into structural change and attention to power relations. And we need to discard concepts that diminish responsibility or erase history and focus on unconscious, decontextualized attitudes. And finally, the third action is to remember that mission matters.
Mm.
And this is a phrase that I borrow from a historical analysis of Mount Holyoke and Oberlin, two colleges that produced many more teachers who worked in Southern Black communities during Reconstruction than any other white institution, Harvard, Yale, all the, including institutions that were teaching colleges. The numbers in these two colleges, Mount Holyoke and Oberlin, were only matched by African American schools, such as Lincoln University and the Institute of Colored Youth. So what did these colleges do? So both Oberlin and Mount Holyoke, according to this historical analysis, succeeded in pulling many of their students out of life as usual, urging them into alternative action. And those actions were encouraged or inspired by their discourses, the discourses and the missions of these two schools. So, quote, for the African American teachers and the white female teachers, the initiative, resourcefulness, and independence required of them stood in stark negation of sanctified social conventions. And those were one of the things that the article talks a lot about is those were very, very difficult times for the communities, but also for working in the communities, because these teachers and these people were not exactly, supported. And yet these colleges were able to, do something that inspired people to be a part of it. So in closing, as we teach students skills and strategies to fight injustice, we need to nurture their empathy and the convictions that brought them to social work in the first place. So.
Thank you for that. In terms of, I often say to my colleagues that it's so important for us as faculty to go back to touch, and again, the metaphor of fire, to touch the fire that fueled our passion initially, that sometimes we forget what it is that God used to get us excited every day, and that we could envision a world that we were going to change. So I'm wondering, Karina, your thoughts in terms of how we train and think about the future, and also to really think about what types of race equity achievements you hope to see for the profession. You're on mute.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Yolanda. I was struck the other day, and not surprised, when the Canadian folks found 215 mass graves of Native children who had been hidden and buried at Kamloops Residential School, Native boarding school there, First Nations people. And since then, that number's tripled with, more information coming out with ground penetrating sonar. And I raise that because that is not about structural racism. And I think this is where we have work to do. We have to look at how structural racism and settler colonialism intersect.
Mm.
And we have to think deeply about how structural racism is a mechanism of settler colonialism, and how undoing or eliminating racism does not get rid of settler colonialism, because settler colonialism is the fuel, it is the fire that keeps things going. It just changes its face in clever ways. So the great example that Gary, you alluded to earlier, is post emancipation came Reconstruction. It came in another face. Settler colonialism persisted. So eliminating racism is important and a great goal, but it's not the end game. And so I think this is where we have to wrestle as a profession and as a field. What does that look like to dismantle structures of settler colonialism? And what is settler colonialism, right? So it's deeper than structural racism. And so for me, I think elevating some of the issues around settler colonialism is critical, because the U.S. is a settler colonial society. You know, it was created by settlers who arrived and stayed with the presumption of sovereign entitlement to land and an unshakable belief that was rooted in white supremacy logic and fueled by Christian European men who understood that they were superior to all other races, and by definition had the right to possess and control our land and dispossess and steal our land for indigenous people, and the right to control and possess people's labor and people. That is the root of America. So when I hear things like Don Lemon say the other day, we have a virus, racism is a virus. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. But then I said, well, wait a minute, virus is an exogenous thing that comes into your body. It's an invader. I said, racism is not an invader. It's actually part and parcel of the body. It's part of the founding of America. And we still have yet to fully grapple with that. And we're starting to. The truth telling is happening now. Anyway, settler colonialism is a structure. It is not an event. There are racist events that uphold this structure, right? So I think this is where I would like us to unpack some of that. And it includes three main forms that I think we need to tackle in the future work as social workers. It's primarily through strategies of land dispossession, getting indigenous people erased from the land and the landscape. And often what accompanies that is settler colonial narratives or origin stories to replace it to justify the stealing or taking of the land, or minimizing or disavowing the violence that settler colonialism still maintains, right? There's a lot of disavowal practices that happen. Good example of that is we have Sacagawea on a coin as if she was a great help in helping but she was a 12-year-old girl who was bought by Charbonneau, who was like 45 years old. It was the first example of, in my book, of sex trafficking and enslavement, but yet she celebrated as if she was helping this natural westward passage to come through for Lewis and Clark. It's those kinds of stories that we all, for those who are raised in this country and those who come into this country, are socialized into, that maintains these structures and keeps them in place. So it's about strategies of land disposition. It's about erasure, erasing our stories, erasing our histories. And it's about chattel slavery. And it still is about chattel slavery. And it's about anti-Black racism that is still embedded in our structures today. And we can see it with mass incarceration and police and state violence and all of these other elements. That's another area that we really have to talk about. And now redlining, right, is coming back again. And the strategies of exploitation and exclusion that targets immigrants and refugees of color. These are the three areas where structural aspects of settler colonialism continues to manifest and continues to grow. And all of this happens while there's a disavowal. So settler colonialism is very tricky. It's very good at disavowing the violence of itself. It tells a different story. And so this is why we're living in a time of really crazy alternate facts that creates crazy alternate realities. This is where settler colonialism can reinvent itself even further. So we have a lot of work to do to really look at, what does democracy mean if we undo settler colonialism? What does that look like for all of us to be really free? What does liberty really look like under conditions of being free from settler colonialism? So we have a lot of work to do. And the last thing I would just like to say, on the practice end of things, it's about building from our original teachings, because all of our peoples have beautiful original instructions that predate settler colonialism, and growing from our community strengths, obviously. It's restoring relational ways of being in the world, because what settler colonialism does is to disrupt all of our relational ways of being, to our bodies, our families, our communities, our lands, each other. And it's about transforming our narratives, how we talk and think about each other, because ultimately it is about us coming together as a country and as people to live in a more healthful world. And we all want that for our children. And that's where the fire continues to live, is through our children, into the next 7 generations. I see our children. And if we can see our children, then we can heal the 7 generations that run behind us as well. It's a powerful place to be. So social work is in a point of great power, and I'm hoping that we use it wisely. So thank you.
And Jan Lee, your thoughts in terms of what equity from the profession and training that next generation? Thank you, Karina.
Yeah, first of all, truth telling so important, and it doesn't just apply to history. It also applies to now. As Karina said and Yolanda said, we're in settings now where stuff is going on, settler colonialism, imperialism, etc. And we need to tell the truth about that. You know, we need to step up and be forward. And social workers are in those settings, so they need to be the truth tellers. There's a dilemma when you're in those settings as a social worker. Do you adopt the identity of the oppressor, you know, as Frantz Fanon said, or do you step it up and be a true ethical activist, social justice warrior, social worker? You know, which one are you going to do? And yeah, it's easy for us to like talk about it and say intellectually, oh yeah, I'd be the warrior person, right? It takes a lot of courage and a lot of bravery to speak out and tell the truth. Where you work, with who you work with. And the more you do it, the higher risk it is to you, you know, because at some point the system can crush you. It can do things to your job. It can do things to your mental health. It can be depressing and lead you to despair. So the challenge is going to be, if you're going to bring the fight, bring it in a smart way. And it's smart meaning today's society is much harder to be a truly ethical, strong social worker because we're so polarized. You know, we just end up being diverted into like a civil war. We need to go beyond that because the system requires change. We can't just fight among ourselves. So I want to give a quick example of a social worker in California who worked at LA County Jail. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic. The jail, another oppressive system, even worse than you can imagine, was not providing PPE and practicing health safety standards with not only the staff, but also the inmates. And we all know the disproportionality of the inmates, Black and brown inmates in the correctional system. So she took it upon herself to be an advocate for the staff to get PPE, as well as for the inmates. And she was blocked at every point because basically when we lock up people, particularly Black and brown people, we just forget about them, throw away the key, they deserve to be there, we should punish them with inhumane treatment, you know, we should let them all get sick, who cares, you know. And the correctional staff, many of them agree with that. And they themselves are the ones going around saying, I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to get vaccinated. I probably won't get sick, but those inmates, if they get sick, not a problem. So it took a social worker and her social work colleagues to raise their voices, to tell the truth, to say, we need to change this. And when they were blocked at every point within the institution, they came to NASW. They came to the California chapter and they said, what can we do? How can you help us? So we organized together. We worked the political angle. We went to the County Board of Supervisors. We contacted the governor's office, the state legislature. We did everything we could to try to build a coalition to address this. And while some small changes were made, as you know, Karina said, it's so pervasive that that system is still there in the county jail, despite all the work that social workers and other advocates did. But they at least raised their voices, people heard, and maybe in their time there, what they did, they can say they pushed the needle a little bit. But the whole system needs a lot of advocacy, and we need to fight to get there.
Thank you all for those comments. And I want to encourage those in the audience to use the chat if you have comments or questions or points of clarification that you would like. Please put those in the chat and we will respond to those. As I think about this conversation that we've been having, the being able to anchor in history, and it's the Sankofa moment. I keep coming back to the way in which I think about Sankofa, which is standing in the present, looking at the past, and facing towards the future with. And if you look at the Sankofa bird, a wooden Sankofa bird, it has an egg in its mouth, which is the future that it's carrying and facing forward with, and that we are doing all of those things at the same time. That our history, we are our history. Our history helps to inform our present and can inform the future for us, and it will inform it whether we know it or not. And that's true, particularly when we think about trauma. And Karina, you touched on this over the 7 generations, and really thinking about Resmaa Menakem's work in the area of trauma, and talking about 14 generations and this meeting and meeting of trauma across generations. But then you also think about the colonizers, the settlers, those people who left. I always say to my students, the people who have it good and places stay, they're not the ones who leave. And so when we begin to look at those folks who make that journey, they too are leaving something that hasn't worked. I look at the legacy here in Boston, where I am, of the story of the Irish immigrants who made the journey here, and the traumatic experiences that they'd had with the English colonizers, and then the ways in which that was manifested here against other groups as they became landed people and had some power. So we watched the way in which we pass these narratives along. And so it strikes me as we think about the past, the present, the future. We're now 50 years since Nixon declared the war on drugs in this country. We've been in this 50-year war, and it was declared. You go back and listen to the tape of another way of 50 years into post-Jim Crow of being able to figure out how to make the system work again to get people back in and under control. Yet at the same time, we sit in a generation, and social workers should be outraged, where we're about to let the Sackler family walk away with their fortune intact and not be held accountable for the kind of invasion of opioids into our communities. And so my question to that is, as we think about the social worker now, my student, your students, your interns, the people that you work with, the people that you see, what do they need to be thinking about as they go forth into this change melange of issues that heretofore they've not necessarily been taught to think about? Colonialism isn't taught. There are laws now in the books to make sure that we don't talk about it. That's what's happening. We're trying to stop the 1619 Project and stopping to create critical race theory and interrogating white supremacy, is to make sure there's only one historical narrative, and that's the narrative of exceptionalism, right? So I find with my students in my policy class, I have to teach history before we can even begin to talk about how do we change the system. Your thoughts in terms of how we do this when we're talking about social justice and an anti-racist, white supremacist, anti-white supremacist lens to infuse in our profession. Yolanda, I'd be interested in your thoughts or reactions. And you're on mute.
Yes, there.
Very good.
So my thoughts are similar to what I said earlier. I think that a lot of these things, we can't just do cognitive education. A lot of these things are effective. And so just telling students that these things are happening and giving them these terms and all of that, it's important, of course, but it's not enough for them to really understand it. They also, starting their lives. They don't have the experience that we have. So we need to teach in ways where they can imagine these kinds of things that even we can't imagine. so that they can actually then think about. I always begin with them thinking about and getting a sense of how it affects people's lives. The pain that it causes, the futures that are affected, that kind of thing. And so I pay a lot of attention to that part, so that as they get to understand this, and there are a lot of ways of doing this. And research shows that learning requires this right brain, left brain approach. There are many ways, of course. They can visit places, but also literature is like my number one go-to, so that they will then begin to think about, understand the system that they're in, the people we're reading about, but also the kinds of things that need to change. So it's very powerful. There's again, I'm talking pedagogically here. There's that's a study of 27 countries of students, where they look at what students are learning in terms of critical thinking and things like that. And students who read, they did all kinds of things to figure out how that affected them. They have a greater sense of agency. They have a greater sense of interculturality in dealing with other groups, that kind of thing. So as you say, we have to start do all these things before we even get to the
change. Right. Yes. Yeah. Karina, your thoughts in terms of where we are now. In particular, I'm interested, as you've done work in substance abuse and really thinking about the racialization of substance abuse in this war on drugs.
Oh yeah, my tribe sued. My tribe actually sued. Was part of a massive lawsuit against those folks because of the amount of opioids that were brought into our communities and made our people really sick. And we're dealing with the consequences of that now. Whether it's anyway, so that is a major issue. To your point on the point that you said, Gary, I have to reteach history, and every time I have to start from to get history 101 in, because people are not taught proper history in this country about what happened. And the aha moments, I think, Yolanda, to your point, happen when people get more information and realize that, oh, wait a minute. This is not at all what I was taught or how I understood things to be. And then they begin to be open and shifting their point of view, and in some cases get angry. But there's a reaction that sometimes happens. And Eve Tuck calls this settler moves to innocence, to try to, it's almost becomes overwhelming. So people disconnect from it a little bit. And they don't want to deal with the settler guilt and all this other stuff that goes along with it. And what I see in this generation is a lot of performative wokeness that really boggles my mind. And to me, it's another settler move to innocence. So, and students in this, I think this generation is dealing with a lot of misinformation coming at them from all kinds of different directions. And now we're unsettling further their understanding of the world. I think it's a unique teaching time for a number of us with respect to that. And I think a lot of our young people grab onto what they can control in their immediate environment, in their immediate setting, which is quite often attacking social work as a profession, or attacking each other, or calling each other out constantly. And we end up, no one benefits ultimately from that, right? Calling out, for me, as an old school organizer back in the day, you did that in a strategic moment so that had the most power in that moment. And you thought about why you were doing that. You didn't do it just to call someone out. And so those kinds of understanding the difference between strategies of undoing or dealing or addressing racism and other kinds of things, and that there are different strategies under different contexts and how to do that is important. So that strategy piece, I think that speaks to John Lee's point earlier as well. And how do we deal with people not turning inward and only looking at themselves or only looking at the profession as a problem, because those are the areas that they can control the most. If we're asking them to go outward and actually dismantle and think about these structures and institutions in which we're embedded. And so I think as educators, we're in a trickier time with respect to that, with this era and age of information, massive amounts of information that are circulating all the time. So for me, the performative wokeness bothers me, and decolonization is a metaphor. You know, people perform decolonization, land acknowledgements, and things like that, but unless action follows, it's meaningless. So I just don't want us to become a performative profession. It's not helping anybody, and I don't think we will. But those are my worries for the future and what we're doing.
Interesting. Stanley, anything that you would add?
Yeah, I want to put a pitch in for field education. And first of all, I want to thank all of those of you out there that have volunteered currently or in the past to be a field instructor, a field supervisor. A field is the place, I feel, where the rubber hits the road. So you're sitting there in supervision with a student, they're going over what they're doing in their field placement. That's the time when you explore first self-awareness and try to get that student to start to add in those elements that we are talking about today. Systemic racism, you know, colonial framework, you know, just try to get at those feelings that they might have first about themselves, then about their clients. That's the tricky part. That's where the field instruction comes in. How do you blend that in when you're talking to the client? Because generally, they're going to be talking about basic needs, you know, housing, food, shelter, income, etc. But if they don't get the whole picture like you do, then they won't be able to move forward like they should. And then once that happens and they start to kind of see that, this is where you want to add in the macro policy elements. So when talking to a student and saying, boy, what's going on at my agency is terrible, and the policies they have are terrible, and the policies seem to be trying to keep clients down, push down, they're never going to get ahead. That's when you bring in the macro elements and you say, can we change that? What policies can we try, both at the organizational level, at the agency level, but if we need to, at the legislative level, whether it's state or federal. So that's what I think can really help push us forward and address those big issues, you know, the systemic issues, the framework issues, but we got to start at the beginning to try to get people to get in touch with themselves. And if we're successful with that whole picture, then we are contributing to critical thinking. And that's one of the most valuable tools that our future social workers can have, is critical thinking.
Okay. It's also, as I've listened to this conversation, and I can only share with you, colleagues, how privileged this moment has been for me in the midst of a long, hard week. Somehow we all, at least as an academic, I get caught in this wheel somehow that everything has to be done by June 30th because everything is going to start new again, and versus it just being a day. So we're rushing down to a finish line to get things done. But the opportunity to just pull back for a moment and reflect on a profession that I love and hold dear, but also because I love it, I hold it accountable in a different way. Love for me brings a different degree of accountability. Love for me brings with it a responsibility for honesty. And it's very seductive sometimes as a social worker to buy into the belief that we are the social justice profession. And every time I say that, I believe it, but I also know examples of people who are not in our profession invested in social justice, who really are invested in maintaining the status quo. That when we talk about being an anti-racist profession, that I know patent racists who have been involved in the profession, or at least I'm learning in some of the discussions that I've been having during this period, that we don't align in interesting ways. And so being able to take a look with love at something that I believe in is an opportunity to also think about what can we get right. That we were participating in internment camps and with the removal of the Japanese, that we have worked with in child welfare with the removal of children, that we've been involved in the work in eugenics of the sterilization of women based on mental health, or if it was determined that they were promiscuous, and that we started out as a profession, as an organization in segregation. So somehow the myth, we never talk about who we were during the period when segregation was legal in this country, which meant that we practiced in segregated ways. The work of Iris Carlton Linnaeus around the settlement house movement, when Black people and immigrants couldn't go to settlement houses, so we had to create our own to be able to get the benefits of that. That history is also the story that we have to tell, because we come through it, and that which we don't know we can fall back into if we don't understand and know the genesis from which we come, that we're complicated, that we're messy, and that we have been, in Speck's words, at times unfaithful angels, if you will. And so what the opportunity allows us to do now in this moment, in this time, is to be able to acknowledge the flawed nature, the beautiful flawed nature of our profession, that it is beautifully flawed, which to me makes it even more accessible, because we're not perfect, and it affords us an opportunity to be even better than we have been heretofore. So I wonder, as we close, and we will be joined in a moment by our esteemed executive director, Angelo McLean, and I don't see questions in the chat, but Raffaele, if there are, please let me know. If there's one closing line that you have for the audience as we move forward out of this conversation into the releasing of this report, any sentence perhaps that you'd like to leave people with as your closing takeaway for today. Karina.
Actually, I do. I have a song from, I'm not going to sing it, but from Yolale Prefe, but I'll just read a little bit of lines from it. It's called Going Home, and she's an American Indian singer, songwriter, and she's writing about the relationship with American Indians in Alaska, American Indians and African Americans, as we were both enslaved at some point during the slavery system. A lot of people don't know that we lost 2 million of our people to slaves as well. And my own tribe was shipped to mostly Haiti and other places, part of the Triangle Trade. But so she wrote the song, and she says, going home, she said, Creator, I'm reaching out to you, tell them on the other side that they are alive within my soul. Return their prayers that run through my veins. Return the land and heal her pain. The hidden truth, tell the world. The blues, where it comes from. Where the Neuse River runs through a land where my great-grandmother sleeps. Under the earth, blood of Skakura Nation was free. I hear Nigerian chains. They say they are buried real deep. Tobacco fields, trail of tears. Stolen people on stolen land. Tell them that I know.
That's beautiful and powerful. Yolanda, thank you, Karina.
I would say a final thought is to constantly go to the communities who are affected by the things we're talking about and get the stories from them. Constantly, constantly, constantly. There are many hidden things, immigration. I mean, I'm the child of immigrants. There are many things that people don't really know from the outside. But you can never fail if you go to the communities and where they live and hear their stories to really get the story right.
Right, thank you. Jan Lee.
Yeah, I would say struggle, both internal and external, yourself and those around you, your society. I would say rise up, take action. As I said before, it requires courage and bravery. And then finally, take care of yourself. We social workers do really hard work, and it is exhausting. So when you add on the element of trying to do the things that we've been talking about today, it's even more heavy in terms of the load. So take care of yourself. There are many people around you, NASW, programs and services, your colleagues. We can all help each other take care of ourselves.
Thank you all for this moment and for this time. And thank you, NASW, for being there and providing this space. And now it is my honor and privilege to turn this over to Dr. Angelo McLean to bring it home. Angelo?
Thank you, Gary, for the opportunity to bring this home, and hopefully home is where we can bring this, and home being the place in our hearts, in our minds. You know, I'm so hopeful that today will be a really strong reference point for our profession, that where we can say on Juneteenth 2021, we put a stake in the ground to acknowledge our complicity with racism, the perpetuation of racism, and we put a stake in the ground that says we are sorry for those sins, and then we put another stake in the ground that said, by golly, by gee, that, or damn it, we're going to do better. We're going to be part of making sure that we achieve racial equity in our country in our lifetime. We're going to be purposeful. We're going to be deliberate. We know we have a shameful past, and we know there's a lot of lessons we can learn from our shameful past. We just don't have to beat ourselves up with it. We can use that to elevate us in our striving for justice. We know in the past sometimes when we advocated for justice, it wasn't justice for all. It was sort of a question of justice for who's included, who's excluded. We don't want any exclusions. We want everyone to be included. And we know that the discrimination, the oppression that we have tolerated, whether through silence or through complicity, is basically saying that othering is somehow, some way, othering is okay. That there's one group that's superior and the rest of us are inferior. We want to eliminate and do away with othering. You know, othering is a myth, and those distinctions are only social constructions. Karina, thank you again for joining us. You've helped us so much with this racial justice series, and I know we're going to be asking. I know not only NASW but all of social work is asking you for your leadership. I love your story about the fire. That's God's presence on earth. And how acknowledging the truth can help us reignite a new fire, and that new fire can bring us forward. And we aren't crabs in a bucket. We aren't crabs in a bucket. We aren't crabs in a bucket. And you keep reminding us that we have to go beyond racism and go to deconstructing colonial structures. And there's a lot that we all need to learn about that, and the nuances there. And as you say, that's the oppressor's way of perpetuating an advantage that's not needed. Jan Lee, every opportunity we get these days to be in your presence, it's a good thing. You talked about the chapters being a backbone and the work that our chapters have done, and just a big shout out to our chapters for all the work that our chapters did on this issue of during this racial reckoning and achieving racial equity. The chapters were just excellent, and the more our chapters did, the more it fueled me to be a supporter and a believer. You gave us, Jan Lee, a warning. Let's be aware of the new forms of Jim Crow and racism, and make sure that where there's housing discrimination, voting restrictions, that we're aware of that, and we fight. They're new fights, but they're part of the old fights. And then you gave us another caution. Let's not think we can get this done overnight. It's incremental. And sometimes we can have breakthrough improvements, and we always are striving for breakthrough. But if we're making incremental progress, let's build off of that. Yolanda, thank you for. I mean, you said one thing that really resonated with me was like, as social workers, let us be a step ahead. Let us, lead the way. Let us be the examples. Let us reject those notions that somehow say certain communities, are viewed in this negative perspective. You talked about our hidden strengths within our, and we know our strengths, and partly it's because we've not been able to be our authentic selves in the mainstream society, and we need the mainstream society to accept us and embrace us. So our strengths don't have to be hidden. So our strengths can just come out and in full force because we have so much to contribute to our communities. And thank you, Gary. You did remind us about let's touch that fire that fueled our initial passions. And I appreciate everyone who's participated in this series of town halls. I think we've had probably, I don't know, 12, and we had different topics, but your authentic voice that you've put out through your questions, through your comments, have helped us shape this series. Today we're launching a survey, and we want to get some information from our members and from folks who aren't members. If you're not a member of NSW, please consider being a member so you can help further this work. But a survey so we can find out what are your areas of interest in racial justice, what is resources that you need so you can do work in your community, and what should we be focused on and looking forward. And the link to the survey is near the link on our website to the report on to the profession and racial justice priorities and actions. I'm going to do 2 commercials and then I'll end. Next Tuesday, between Tuesday the 22nd to Thursday the 24th, we're having a national conference. And if you haven't sort of registered and signed up for it, I would encourage you to do it. And then the following Tuesday, June 29th, we're having a leadership summit where we're bringing leaders, and I say leaders, we're all leaders, together to say, where do we want to go as a profession in terms of leadership? And there'll also be some professional development there as well. I love the stories we were telling. I love the poems. And I was hoping that Karina, maybe you would have sang, but I think our stories, our poems, it's like the same, the culture, the things, those expressions are so important to this work. And so we want to encourage the poems, the expression. And I really want to thank the panel again for helping us, and we're going to be calling on you. And this work continues. We're going to do a racial justice summit in the fall where we can bring many voices together, and collectively as a profession, we can make a commitment to moving forward collectively. We've got to do this work together. So we'll say so long for now, and I will say happy Juneteenth. Celebrated, and as Mitch said, the celebration is about more than eating barbecue. It's about making commitments. It's about really understanding the history. But I will have a slice of barbecue as I celebrate Juneteenth. Thank you all.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe, everyone.